May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The disciples did not know, obviously, that this was to be their last time together as a community. This was going to be the last time they all sat down to share a meal together. This was the last time they were going to enjoy that fellowship with Jesus. This was the last time that he would be present among them as their teacher and their Lord and their master. This was the last time that they were actually going to hear him teach them. Our gospel lesson this morning is actually a continuation of last Sunday's gospel, a piece of John's gospel called the Last Discourse. Where we are is the Last Supper. Judas has just gone out, and the apostles are lounging at the table with Jesus, and he is speaking to them about what's going to happen. Again, he's sort of laying it out for them, because we know that the apostles needed things told to them in very simple terms to figure out what it was Jesus was trying to say. And so again, he is speaking to them about what is to come, what it's going to be like once he leaves them. And there's a very particular part of this gospel lesson. Jesus says to them, I will send you another advocate. Jesus himself was the first advocate. Jesus himself was there among them. He had walked with them, talked with them, shared their lives, taught them. He had preached with them and to them. They had gone out themselves and discovered the power of God. And they understood that as coming through Jesus' teaching, his actual physical presence among them. So he had been the first advocate that God had sent to be among the disciples. But now, what John's gospel is telling us is that God is going to send a second advocate to be with the apostles. And if we look a little bit deeper at that word advocate, the Greek word is paraclete. Paraclete was a word that in that point in time actually had a legal connotation. If you were called into court for some reason, you had to speak on your own behalf. There was no such thing as a lawyer or a legal team. You couldn't hire somebody to present your case. You had to go before the court and present your case yourself. However, you could hire someone, a paraclete, an advocate, to sit with you, to whisper in your ear and give you some advice, to review your case ahead of time and be ready to help you out in court if you needed a little bit of help. It has the understanding and the connotation of somebody who's walking alongside you, someone helping to guide you through this time, through this trial. I remember really vividly learning this word paraclete. I was in the 7th grade and preparing for confirmation. And in my Catholic school, we prepared for confirmation all year long. And somewhere around January, I learned the word paraclete, and I thought it was the coolest word I had yet learned. And so for about the next 3 months, I used it every single time I could think of, until my parents got really sick of hearing about the paraclete this and the paraclete that. But I really liked this image and this idea of God walking alongside. This feeling of support, of companionship, of guidance from beside instead of in front of. And so that's what Jesus is saying to his disciples this morning. I I, the first advocate, am about to leave you. But God will send you another advocate, a paraclete, to walk alongside, to guide you, to speak with you, to help show you the path. But the difference here is before the disciples were just following. Jesus walked, the disciples followed. Jesus wasn't going to be in front anymore. The disciples were going to be free to choose their own path, to walk their own way, to find the way forward on their own. They were going to have to listen for God in a new way, to find understanding in a different way than they had known it before. And I think this is the same way God continues to work with us. The Paraclete came to the disciples, our ancestors in the faith, and ever since then, God has been walking beside us, offering us guidance, those quiet whispers in our ears. But at the same time, our path before us is our own. We're not being led or even pushed from behind. We're being companioned from the side, invited to make our own decisions and find our own ways. And I think this can be really challenging for us. We as human beings love to put somebody out front and say, okay, you blaze the path and we'll all follow behind you. We're going to wait and see what happens to you. But if you're brave and courageous and we believe in you, we're right behind you, man. We're with you. We like sometimes to be told what to do. We like to be told where to go. It's much easier. We don't have to ask questions. We don't have to think a whole lot. We can just follow the person in front of us and consider it all good. But so often that's not the way our life is, and that's certainly not the way our spiritual lives are most of the time. We may find somebody that we really resonate with and feels is really guiding us and leading us. But most of the time we are companioned by God. We are invited to walk alongside. And this becomes harder for us. And the understanding of it, I think, even more challenging when we experience tragedies like Friday night in Santa Barbara, when we experience violence. Because we have to believe and understand that God was still there. God was still walking beside. God was still walking beside the young people who survived and the young people who didn't. God was walking beside everyone who was present and those who have ministered with them since that tragedy. We have to understand that God was there, or else we just fall into despair, because then God must have left us. And if God has left, what do we have? Hopelessness, despair, loss, fear. So as Christian people, we have to believe that God was still present, that God was walking and companioning with those people. But I think what is even harder for us is that we are also forced to believe that God was walking beside that young man who shot those people. But in his rage and illness, he couldn't hear it. He couldn't find it. And so he was lost. We prefer to separate into good and bad, easy and hard. But so much of the time, our lives and our spiritual lives just don't fall into those neat categories. If we believe God is walking with us, then God's got to be walking with everyone. God's got to be walking in those times of violence and tragedy, as well as in those times of joy and celebration. And that is the good news, that in those times of violence and tragedy and horror, we still believe that God is beside us, that God is still helping us walk forward. But the path is open. We're making our own decisions. We're finding our own way. God is simply inviting us one way or another. And sometimes we are open and we can hear and we understand. And sometimes we don't. And sometimes, like that Friday night, God is so shut out that the rage and the madness take over. And tragedy is in our midst. John tells us that God is always walking beside, that the advocate has been sent, that the paraclete is present with us. And as Christian people, we must believe that. We must believe that God is walking beside us, that God is companioning us on our way, that God is present in the gift, in the celebration, and in the tragedy as well, allowing some hope to be found, allowing some goodness to be shown through, even when we don't think we can find any. Because it's God walking beside that brings that goodness, that allows the light to shine, that reminds people that they're not alone, that God is there, that the paraclete is at work. Amen.